In the year 43 CE, the course of England's history was irrevocably altered. The distant echoes of tribal life, fragmented and insular, were about to collide with one of the most formidable empires the world had ever seen, Rome. Emperor Claudius, seeking both prestige and control over the British Isles, dispatched a carefully organized invasion force. The Roman legions, professional soldiers hardened by decades of conquest in Gaul and Hispania, landed on the southern shores of Britain, confronting an island of fiercely independent tribes whose lives had been shaped by centuries of isolation, local alliances, and internecine warfare. The southern lands of what is now England were dominated by tribes such as the Catavilani, Atrebates, Trinovants, and Debuni. Each had its own social structures, rulers, and networks of trade, often interacting with continental Europe through trade routes that stretched across the Channel. The initial Roman assault was swift and brutal. The tribes, though skilled in guerrilla tactics and intimate with their local terrain, were no match for the discipline, engineering prowess, and organization of the legions. Within months, Roman forces established control over key settlements, transforming them into garrisons and administrative centers. Yet, the conquest was not uncontested. One of the most famous resistances came from the Iceni, a tribe of eastern Britain. Around 60 to 61 CE, the Iceni, under the leadership of Boudicca, rose in a rebellion that would become legend. Boudicca, motivated by Roman abuses, the seizure of lands, and personal indignities inflicted upon her family, mobilized a coalition of tribes to strike against Roman authority. Her forces swept through Camulodunum, modern Colchester, Londinium, London, and Verulamium, St. Albans, leaving these early Roman towns in flames. Archaeological evidence confirms widespread destruction during this period, with burned layers of ash found in several settlements. The Roman response, however, was decisive. A disciplined legion, strategically outnumbered but better trained and organized, confronted Boudicca's army, ultimately crushing the revolt in battle. Her defeat did not merely end a rebellion. It solidified Rome's determination to establish permanent control over Britain. Over the next decades, Roman Britain evolved from a conquered territory into an integrated province of the empire. Roads were constructed with meticulous precision, connecting towns, forts, and ports, facilitating trade, troop movement, and administrative control. Aqueducts, amphitheaters, and baths reflected the imposition of Roman culture and urban sophistication. Londinium, initially a modest settlement, grew into a thriving commercial hub and port, its streets lined with shops, administrative offices, and forums. The Romans introduced coinage, taxation, and a bureaucratic system that allowed distant London to communicate with Rome across vast distances with remarkable efficiency. Religious life also transformed. While native Britons adhered to polytheistic traditions tied to nature and tribal deities, the Romans brought their pantheon of gods and cults, alongside philosophical ideas imported from the Mediterranean world. Temples were constructed in urban centers, and the fusion of native and Roman religious practices often created unique hybrid cults. Celtic shrines were sometimes incorporated into Roman temples, reflecting a nuanced cultural assimilation rather than simple replacement. By 122 CE, under Emperor Hadrian, the northern frontier of Roman Britain was fortified with the construction of Hadrian's Wall. Stretching over 73 miles from the Solway Firth in the west to the River Tyne in the east, the wall was more than a defensive barrier. It was a symbol of Rome's ambition, authority, and administrative ingenuity. Forts, mile castles, and watchtowers punctuated the landscape, manned by auxiliary troops drawn from across the empire. The wall not only defended against northern tribes, like the Picts in what is now Scotland, but also served as a customs barrier and a statement of imperial dominance. Economically, Roman Britain thrived under imperial integration. Agriculture expanded with new techniques and tools introduced by Roman settlers. Villas dotting the countryside suggest a class of wealthy landowners adopting Roman lifestyles, complete with mosaics, hypocaust heating, and private baths. Mining flourished, particularly in lead, tin, and iron, feeding industries both locally and abroad. Trade with continental Europe and across the empire increased, bringing exotic goods, wine, and luxury items to Roman Britain's cities and towns. However, life under Rome was not without tension. Rebellions, though rare after Boudica, occasionally erupted, particularly in regions that resisted full Romanization. Tribal leaders sometimes collaborated with Roman authorities, navigating a delicate balance between power and subjugation. Social stratification became more pronounced. Roman citizens and veterans enjoyed privileges, while native Britons often occupied lower tiers in urban and rural hierarchies. Slavery existed, though the scale was smaller than in Mediterranean provinces, often involving prisoners of war, debt slaves, or criminals. Over nearly 4 centuries, Roman Britain underwent cycles of prosperity, turmoil, and transformation. Forts, roads, and towns became the backbone of a province that was both economically productive and strategically valuable. The Roman legal system introduced concepts of governance and justice that would echo through English history. Latin inscriptions, monuments, and coins testify to a society that had been fully woven into the broader fabric of the empire. Yet, the stability of Roman Britain was not eternal. By the late 4th and early 5th centuries, Rome itself faced immense pressures. Invasions along the Rhine, civil wars, and economic collapse undermined the empire's ability to maintain distant provinces. In 410 CE, with the Western Roman Empire in crisis, Emperor Honorius effectively abandoned Britain, instructing the Britons to defend themselves. Without Roman troops and administrative oversight, towns fell into decline, trade networks collapsed, and local leaders, once subordinate to Roman governors, reasserted power. Britain fragmented into a collection of petty kingdoms, each struggling to survive in a landscape increasingly threatened by external raiders, particularly from the North Sea and the continent. The Roman withdrawal did not erase the legacy of centuries of imperial influence. The roads, walls, and towns left behind provided the foundation upon which subsequent societies would build. Latin literacy persisted in monasteries, coins and material culture remained in circulation, and Roman ideas of law, engineering, and governance lingered, influencing the emerging Anglo-Saxon polities. The transition was not abrupt. For decades, Britons retained Roman ways of life alongside newly arriving Germanic peoples, including the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, whose migrations would eventually define the next era. By the end of the Roman period, England stood at a threshold. The tribal networks of the pre-Roman era had been transformed by 4 centuries of imperial rule, creating a complex society with urban centers, agricultural innovation, and enduring infrastructure. The northern lands remained more resistant, retaining pockets of independent culture, while the south and east were thoroughly Romanized. This dichotomy would shape the incoming Anglo-Saxon settlements and the eventual unification of England. The story of Roman Britain, therefore, is one of conquest, adaptation, and lasting influence. It is a tale of empires clashing with local resistance, of infrastructure and administration reshaping a land, and of a society that, even after the empire's withdrawal, carried forward the innovations, culture, and governance left behind. As the Roman legions departed, England entered a new, uncertain epoch, a time of migration, tribal kingdoms, and eventual unification, a canvas on which centuries of history would continue to unfold. When the Roman legions withdrew from Britain in 410 CE, the island was left vulnerable and fragmented. The roads, walls, and towns that had symbolized Roman power persisted, but without imperial oversight, political authority collapsed. In their absence, Britain entered a turbulent era of migration, settlement, and cultural transformation. Into this power vacuum poured the Germanic peoples, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, whose arrival would redefine the social, political, and linguistic landscape of the island. These people were not invaders in the sense of conquest. They often arrived initially as mercenaries or settlers, invited by local Britons to defend against other raiders, only to gradually assert dominance. By the early 5th century, Britain had become a patchwork. The early Anglo-Saxon period was marked by cultural resilience and transformation. The collapse of Roman authority left Britons to adapt Roman infrastructure for local use, while the Anglo-Saxon newcomers brought new forms of settlement. Villages, often clustered around defensive earthworks, replaced the sprawling Roman towns in the countryside, although cities like London, Londinium, continued to function as commercial and administrative hubs under modified governance. Trade persisted both internally and across the North Sea, connecting England with Frisia, Scandinavia, and the Frankish kingdoms. Religious life underwent profound change during this era. Pagan traditions dominated the Anglo-Saxon world, with deities tied to natural forces and warrior virtues. Sacred groves, ritual ceremonies, and seasonal festivals governed daily life. Yet, in 597 CE, the arrival of Saint Augustine of Canterbury, sent by Pope Gregory the Great, marked a decisive turning point. Augustine established his episcopal see in Canterbury, converting the Kentish elite and laying the foundation for the Christianization of southern England. Over the next centuries, monasteries became centers of learning, literacy, and artistic production, preserving knowledge through turbulent times. The spread of Christianity also facilitated political unification, as kings who converted could leverage the church's authority to legitimize their rule and coordinate alliances. Despite these developments, the Heptarchy remained politically fragile. Kingdoms frequently engaged in warfare over territory, resources, and succession disputes. Northumbria, for a time the most powerful kingdom, exerted influence over neighboring regions, fostering a vibrant intellectual and cultural environment. Monasteries like Lindisfarne produced illuminated manuscripts, and scholars such as Bede, writing in the early 8th century, chronicled England's history with remarkable clarity. Yet, prosperity was uneven, and many smaller kingdoms, such as Sussex and Essex, were often subject to raids or domination by more powerful neighbors. The stability of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was further tested by external threats. Beginning in the late 8th century, Viking raiders from Scandinavia began targeting the eastern and northern coasts. The first recorded Viking attack on England occurred in 793 CE at Lindisfarne, shocking Christian Europe with its brutality. Monks were massacred, treasures looted, and sacred sites desecrated. Over the next decades, raids escalated in frequency and intensity, with Viking longships striking towns, monasteries, and trading ports along the North Sea and Atlantic coasts. By the 9th century, the scale of these incursions had grown from opportunistic raids to full-scale invasions, leading to the establishment of permanent settlements and the creation of the Danelaw, a vast swath of eastern England under Danish control. Amidst this chaos, one figure emerged whose influence would leave an indelible mark on the formation of England as a unified entity: Alfred the Great of Wessex, 871 to 899 CE. Alfred faced a kingdom under siege, with Danish armies threatening to overrun southern England entirely. Through military innovation, political acumen, and strategic alliances, Alfred managed to defend Wessex and push back Viking incursions. He reformed the army, introducing a network of fortified settlements capable of withstanding siege and serving as administrative centers. Alfred also established a system of coastal watchtowers, early warning networks, and reorganized the FYRD, the local militia system, making it more efficient and responsive. But Alfred's achievements were not confined to the battlefield. He was a patron of learning and law, seeking to revive literacy and scholarship in a society destabilized by war. He translated key Latin texts into Old English, ensuring that knowledge of law, religion, and governance was accessible to his people. Alfred codified legal codes, blending traditional Germanic customs with Christian principles, thereby establishing a framework that would influence English law for generations. His reign emphasized the moral and intellectual development of his kingdom alongside military defense, illustrating a holistic approach to leadership. Under Alfred's successors, particularly Edward the Elder and Æthelflæd, Lady of the Mercians, Wessex expanded its influence, gradually bringing other Anglo-Saxon territories under a centralized authority. By the late 9th century, the consolidation of southern and central England under Wessex rule laid the groundwork for the eventual unification of the kingdom. Yet, the Danelaw remained a formidable counterweight, illustrating that England was not a singular, cohesive entity, but rather a patchwork of competing cultures, legal systems, and loyalties. Cultural life in Anglo-Saxon England was rich and dynamic. Artisans produced intricate metalwork, illuminated manuscripts, and wood carvings, blending Germanic traditions with Christian motifs introduced by missionaries. Poetry, oral tradition, and law codes were central to societal identity. The epic poem Beowulf, though composed slightly later, reflects the martial ethos and social structures of this era, capturing the imagination of generations and offering a window into Anglo-Saxon values. Economically, agriculture remained the foundation of life, with villages organized around communal fields and pastures. Trade hubs such as Londonwick, near modern London, connected England with continental Europe, bringing goods like wine, pottery, and luxury items. The introduction of coinage under Mercian and Wessex rulers facilitated commerce, taxation, and the consolidation of power. Social stratification became increasingly codified, with nobles, freemen, and slaves occupying defined roles, though mobility existed through service, marriage, or military achievement. Religion and politics were deeply intertwined. Christian kings leveraged ecclesiastical networks to legitimize authority, enforce law, and coordinate defenses. Monasteries became repositories of knowledge and diplomatic hubs, sending envoys abroad and copying texts from the continent. The spread of Christianity also fostered cultural cohesion, bridging tribal differences and providing a shared ideological framework amid a fractious political landscape. By the close of the 9th century, England had endured centuries of migration, warfare, cultural integration, and external threat. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, once disparate tribal territories, had begun to coalesce under leaders capable of both martial and administrative skill. Alfred's vision of a learned, fortified, and cohesive kingdom laid the intellectual and political foundations for the eventual emergence of a unified England. The legacy of the Heptarchy, with its intricate web of alliances, conflicts, and cultural synthesis, would echo through subsequent centuries, influencing governance, law, and identity in ways that persisted well beyond the Viking era. The era of Anglo-Saxon dominance forged in the crucible of migration and conflict set the stage for the next chapter of English history. The unification of England under a single monarch and the rise of a kingdom that would face internal strife, conquest, and eventually global influence. In this period, the foundations of English identity, law, literacy, Christianity, and resilience against foreign threat were laid. The struggles and triumphs of the Anglo-Saxon period were not merely preludes to the Norman Conquest. They were the crucible in which the idea of England itself began to form, a fragile yet enduring vision that would define centuries to come. The death of Alfred the Great in 899 CE did not mark an end, but a continuation of the profound transformation of England. Alfred's vision of a unified and fortified kingdom laid the foundation for his successors, who would build upon his achievements to gradually consolidate power across a fragmented landscape. His son, Edward the Elder, 899 to 924 CE, and daughter-in-law Æthelflaed, Lady of the Mercians, continued campaigns to reclaim territories from Viking invaders. Their strategies combined military fortification, diplomacy, and administrative innovation, creating a blueprint for what would become a centralized English kingdom. By the early 10th century, the English landscape remained divided between the West Saxons of Wessex, the Mercians of the Midlands, and Viking-controlled territories in the north and east. The Danelaw, established by Danish settlers, represented not only a political division but also a cultural one, with Norse law, language, and customs influencing eastern England. Edward the Elder recognized that military victory alone was insufficient. Lasting unification required integration of these diverse peoples under a single political and legal framework. Strategic marriages, alliances, and treaties played as crucial a role as the sword in gradually aligning these regions. The culmination of these efforts came under Æthelstan, r. 924 to 939 CE, often regarded as the first king of a Economically, Æthelstan introduced measures to stabilize and unify the realm. Coinage was standardized, facilitating trade across regional boundaries and linking England to continental markets. Minting centers were established in strategic towns, including London, Winchester, and York, reinforcing both economic and political control. Markets flourished, and trade expanded not only within England but across the North Sea and along the Channel, fostering connections with Norway, Denmark, and the Frankish territories. The economic stability provided by Æthelstan's policies strengthened the crown's position, enabling him to field armies, fund public works, and maintain alliances. Æthelstan's reign was also defined by diplomatic engagement with Europe. He maintained correspondence with continental rulers and the papacy, securing recognition of his authority and fostering international prestige. He married his sister to continental princes and received envoys from kings and emperors across Europe. These diplomatic relationships not only elevated England's status abroad, but also provided mechanisms for peace and trade, essential for a kingdom emerging from centuries of fragmentation. Despite relative internal stability, Æthelstan faced continued external threats. Viking incursions persisted, though increasingly they were managed through a combination of military preparedness and strategic alliances. Battles such as the Battle of Brennenburg in 937 CE demonstrated the king's capacity to repel coalitions of Norse and Scottish forces seeking to challenge his authority. Contemporary chroniclers, such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, celebrated Brennenburg as a defining moment in the establishment of English national identity, a decisive victory that underscored the emerging unity and resilience of the kingdom. Culturally, Æthelstan's court became a center of learning, religion, and artistry. Monastic institutions continued to flourish, producing manuscripts, chronicles, and legal texts that preserve the intellectual heritage of England. Latin and Old English scholarship advanced in tandem, with monasteries functioning as repositories of knowledge and education for the clergy and nobility alike. Churches and cathedrals were built or expanded, reinforcing Christianity's centrality to English identity and governance. Religious authority was leveraged to legitimize kingship, creating a symbiotic relationship between monarchy and church that would endure for centuries. The early kingdom under Æthelstan also grappled with issues of identity and integration. The absorption of diverse cultural groups, including the Anglo-Saxons of Wessex, the Mercians, the Northumbrians, and the Norse settlers of the Danelaw, required delicate negotiation. Æthelstan's reign demonstrates that unification was not merely the imposition of authority, but the synthesis of traditions, laws, and loyalties into a cohesive political entity. This integration would influence language, law, and customs for generations. The administrative apparatus established under Æthelstan, centering on shires, ealdormen, and local courts, provided mechanisms for governance that persisted through subsequent reigns. Shires were subdivided into hundreds, allowing for taxation, justice, and military levies to be effectively coordinated across the kingdom. Royal officials ensured that the king's directives reached even distant settlements, laying the groundwork for the centralized governance that would characterize medieval England. Æthelstan's successors, including Edmund I, 939 to 946 CE, and Eadred, 946 to 955 CE, faced the dual challenges of Viking threats and internal dissent, but largely preserved the unity he had forged. The framework established during this period enabled England to endure repeated crises, including raids from Norse-Gael rulers of Dublin and Scotland, without fragmenting. By the late 10th century, England had emerged as a coherent political entity with defined borders, codified law, and a recognized monarchy, a remarkable achievement considering the fragmented, war-torn landscape of the previous century. Religion continued to be a unifying force. The Church not only provided moral and spiritual guidance, but also administrative expertise. Monks and bishops maintained records, advised the crown, and facilitated diplomatic relations. Æthelstan's successors invested in ecclesiastical institutions, promoting bishops loyal to the crown and ensuring that religious and political authority reinforced one another. Cathedrals such as Winchester and Canterbury became centers of education, administration, and cultural development, anchoring the kingdom in a shared religious and intellectual framework. The early kingdom also saw the codification of cultural identity. Chronicles, poetry, and legal texts celebrated martial prowess, piety, and loyalty to the crown. Anglo-Saxon art, including illuminated manuscripts, jewelry, and weaponry, reflected both local traditions and the influence of continental Europe, demonstrating the integration of multiple cultural streams into a cohesive English identity. By the mid-11th century, however, England's relative stability faced new pressures. The succession of weak or child monarchs, competing noble factions, and ongoing Viking ambitions exposed vulnerabilities. Yet the political, legal, and administrative structures created under Æthelstan and his successors provided resilience. These frameworks would carry England through the next centuries, until the dramatic upheaval of 1066 CE, when the Norman Conquest reshaped the kingdom in ways both profound and enduring. The period from Alfred's consolidation to Æthelstan's unification illustrates that England was not born overnight. It emerged gradually through decades of strategic governance, military innovation, religious integration, and cultural synthesis. The early kingdom was an experiment in unity, forging cohesion from fragmentation, and establishing institutions, laws, and identities that would endure despite the upheavals of the medieval period. The England of Æthelstan's time was a kingdom conscious of its borders, proud of its military and administrative achievements, and increasingly aware of itself as a single entity, a kingdom poised to meet both internal challenges and external threats with a sense of shared purpose and identity. The year 1066 CE stands as a defining moment in the history of England, a year that would forever alter its political, cultural, and social trajectory. The death of Edward the Confessor left the throne of England contested, sparking a crisis of succession. Among the claimants were Harold Godwin's son, the powerful English earl, and William, Duke of Normandy, who claimed Edward had promised him the crown. This dispute culminated in the Battle of Hastings, fought on October 14, 1066, where William's forces decisively defeated Harold, who was killed in combat. This battle did not merely replace one king with another. It marked the beginning of a radical transformation of English society under Norman rule. William, thereafter known as William the Conqueror, embarked on a systematic campaign to consolidate his authority over a land that was resistant, fractured, and unfamiliar. In the immediate aftermath of Hastings, William faced rebellions across England, particularly in the north, where Anglo-Saxon resistance remained strong. His response was brutal and calculated. The Harrying of the North, 1069 to 1070, involved widespread destruction of villages, crops, and livestock, leaving entire regions depopulated. Though horrifying, these measures secured Norman dominance and demonstrated the lengths to which William would go to maintain control. One of William's most enduring contributions to English governance was the Domesday Book, completed in 1086. This meticulous survey of England's lands, resources, and inhabitants was unprecedented in scope. Every village, manor, and taxable asset was recorded, creating a comprehensive administrative database that allowed the crown to levy taxes efficiently and assert control over both the nobility and the peasantry. Beyond its immediate fiscal purpose, the Domesday Book symbolized a new era, an England whose governance was organized, documented, and centrally managed, a stark departure from the patchwork feudal arrangements of the Anglo-Saxon period. The Norman rule also fundamentally reshaped English social and political structures. The introduction of the feudal system established a hierarchy in which the king granted lands to loyal barons, who in turn owed military service and allegiance. This pyramid of obligation replaced many of the decentralized power structures of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Castles, both military fortresses and administrative centers, dotted the landscape, from the iconic Tower of London to the numerous motte and bailey structures across the countryside. These castles served dual purposes, asserting Norman authority over conquered lands and providing defensive strongholds against revolts. Language and culture underwent dramatic shifts under the Normans. French became the language of the court, administration, and law, while Latin continued as the language of the church and scholarship. Old English, though spoken by the majority of the population, began to absorb Norman vocabulary, a linguistic blending that would eventually evolve into Middle English. This cultural fusion influenced literature. Economically, Norman England benefited from the administrative and agricultural innovations introduced during the conquest. Estates were reorganized to maximize productivity, and manorial systems ensured that peasants worked the land to support both local lords and the crown. Markets in towns flourished, facilitating trade in grain, wool, and luxury goods. Coastal ports, such as Winchester and London, expanded, linking England to continental trade networks and integrating it into the broader economy of Western Europe. Despite these advances, the Norman rule faced persistent challenges. Revolts by Anglo-Saxon nobles, uprisings in the north, and tension between local populations and Norman overlords were constant sources of instability. William's successors, including William II, Rufus, and Henry I, inherited the task of maintaining control over a kingdom that was geographically and culturally diverse. Strategies combined military deterrence, strategic marriage alliances, and legal reforms. The Treaty of Alton and other diplomatic measures helped prevent prolonged civil conflict, though localized uprisings continued to flare throughout the late 11th and early 12th centuries. The Norman period also set the stage for developments in law and governance that would define England for centuries. The establishment of centralized royal courts, the standardization of administrative practices, and the collection of taxes based on doomsday data created a more cohesive state apparatus. These innovations allowed the monarchy to assert authority not only over the nobility, but also over regional jurisdictions, creating a balance between local custom and centralized control. The seeds of England's later legal traditions, including common law, were sown during this period of consolidation. Military organization under the Normans was equally transformative. The feudal levy provided a structured system of raising armies, supplemented by professional knights and mercenary forces. Castles functioned as defensive hubs, administrative centers, and symbols of Norman dominance, ensuring that even distant regions could be held under royal authority. Naval organization, though rudimentary, allowed the crown to control key ports and defend against raids from Scandinavia or France. Culturally, the fusion of Anglo-Saxon and Norman traditions produced a renaissance of art, architecture, and literature. Manuscripts, illuminated texts, and religious works reflected continental influence, while retaining local motifs and narratives. Romanesque cathedrals, abbeys, and fortifications transformed the physical landscape, signaling the enduring presence of a centralized, disciplined, and visually dominant monarchy. English identity, though challenged by foreign rulers, adapted through the synthesis of old and new customs, producing a unique cultural resilience. By the mid-12th century, Norman England had achieved remarkable stability and integration. The crown's authority extended across England, backed by military might, administrative oversight, and ecclesiastical support. Trade, law, and cultural life flourished under a system that, while hierarchical, provided order and cohesion previously unknown in Anglo-Saxon England. Yet beneath the surface, tensions simmered, succession disputes, baronial power struggles, and the lingering memory of Anglo-Saxon traditions ensured that the kingdom remained a dynamic and sometimes fragile entity. The end of the Norman period gave way to the Angevin or Plantagenet succession with Henry II, 1154, setting the stage for the next era of English history. Norman innovations in governance, military organization, law, and culture were not discarded. They became the foundation upon which subsequent dynasties would build. The conquest had not merely imposed foreign rule, it had reshaped England's identity, merging Anglo-Saxon resilience with Norman ambition and continental sophistication. Thus, the period from 1066 to 1154 CE represents more than conquest and occupation. It is the birth of medieval England as a centralized, organized, and culturally vibrant kingdom. The Normans transformed a land of competing Anglo-Saxon kingdoms into a state capable of projecting power, administering justice, and fostering economic and cultural growth. The legacies of the Norman conquest, castles, law codes, linguistic integration, and ecclesiastical reform endured far beyond the lifespans of individual rulers, embedding themselves into the very fabric of England's identity and preparing the kingdom for the challenges and triumphs of the High Middle Ages. The accession of Henry II in 1154 CE inaugurated the Plantagenet dynasty, a lineage that would dominate England for more than 3 centuries, leaving an indelible mark on governance, law, culture, and foreign policy. Henry II inherited a kingdom transformed by Norman institutions, yet fraught with internal tensions and external ambitions. His realm extended beyond England to encompass large portions of modern France, including Anjou, Normandy, Maine, and Aquitaine, through marriage and inheritance, establishing what historians later termed the Angevin Empire. This vast territory required sophisticated administration, diplomacy, and military prowess, setting a standard for centralized medieval monarchy. Henry II's reign highlighted the enduring tension between church and crown. The most infamous episode arose in 1170 CE, when the conflict with Thomas Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, reached its tragic climax. Becket, once a close confidant, opposed the king's attempts to curb clerical privileges and assert royal jurisdiction over the clergy. For knights, interpreting the king's words as a directive, murdered Becket in Canterbury Cathedral. The assassination shocked Christendom, provoking papal outrage and forcing Henry to perform public penance. Beyond its immediate drama, The conflict illustrated the fragile balance of power between secular authority and the church, a dynamic that would recur throughout English history. Henry II also reformed English law and governance in ways that resonated far beyond his reign. He introduced the concept of common law, creating standardized legal procedures that could be applied across the kingdom. Royal courts extended their reach into local disputes, diminishing the arbitrary authority of feudal lords and ensuring that justice reflected a unified, king-sanctioned system. Henry's legal reforms included the development of juries, itinerant judges, and writs, laying the foundation for a judicial structure that influenced not only England but also eventually legal systems around the world. The Plantagenet era was also defined by conflict with France, culminating in the prolonged and devastating Hundred Years' War, 1337 to 1453. This war, initiated by claims to the French crown, involved successive generations of English monarchs, from Edward III to Henry VI. Battles such as Crécy, 1346, and Agincourt, 1415, showcased military innovation, including the use of the longbow, which allowed English forces to achieve remarkable victories against numerically superior French armies. Yet the war also imposed enormous economic and social strains, draining the treasury, decimating populations, and destabilizing regions across both England and France. The conflict would persist for over a century, fostering both national identity and enduring hostilities with the French crown. England during this period was also scarred by catastrophic epidemics, most notably the Black Death, 1347 to 1351. The bubonic plague swept through Europe, reducing the population by an estimated 1/3 to 1/2. England was not spared. Towns, villages, and monasteries suffered immense losses. The resulting labor shortages transformed the economic and social order, weakening the feudal system, empowering peasants to demand better wages and conditions, and provoking legislation such as the Statute of Laborers, 1351, in an attempt to restrain wages. The plague fundamentally altered demographics, labor structures, and societal expectations, accelerating change in ways that would reverberate for generations. Politically, the Plantagenet era experienced periodic instability despite its overarching continuity. Dynastic disputes, disputes with barons, and succession crises punctuated the centuries. Perhaps the most notable challenge was the reign of King John, 1199 to 1216 CE, whose heavy taxation, arbitrary justice, and military failures in France provoked baronial revolt. The result was the Magna Carta, 1215, a document that limited royal authority, codified legal rights for the nobility, and asserted the principle that the king was subject to law. Though initially focused on elite grievances, the Magna Carta would evolve into a foundational symbol of constitutional governance, influencing legal thought and political philosophy across the world. The Plantagenet period was also an era of urban and cultural development. Towns and cities expanded, markets flourished, and trade networks extended across the North Sea and the continent. Cathedrals, monasteries, and universities became centers of learning, scholarship, and art. Gothic architecture transformed England's. The latter Plantagenet period was marked by internal conflict and dynastic upheaval. The Wars of the Roses, 1455 to 1485, a series of bloody battles between the houses of Lancaster and York, erupted from competing claims to the throne and entrenched factionalism among the nobility. Battles such as St. Albans, Towton, and Bosworth Field exemplified the lethal stakes of aristocratic power struggles. The conflict concluded with the victory of Henry Tudor, Henry VII, at Bosworth in 1485, ending Plantagenet dominance and inaugurating the Tudor dynasty. The wars revealed both the vulnerabilities and resilience of England's political structures. Despite internal strife, institutions established during the Plantagenet era, legal frameworks, royal courts, and feudal hierarchies, endured and adapted. Economically, the Plantagenet period witnessed significant growth alongside crises. Agriculture, the backbone of medieval England, benefited from innovations such as the three-field system, improved plowing techniques, and selective breeding, enhancing productivity. Towns expanded as craft guilds, trade networks, and markets proliferated, connecting England with Europe and the Mediterranean. Wool, particularly from the Cotswolds and East Anglia, became a key export, fueling both domestic wealth and continental commerce. Yet these gains were periodically threatened by war, plague, and taxation crises, reflecting the delicate balance between prosperity and vulnerability in medieval society. Socially, the Plantagenet era codified class structures, but also allowed for mobility through service, marriage, and merit. Nobles wielded significant influence, but the crown increasingly asserted authority through centralized courts and administrative offices. Peasantries, while bound to land and local lords, gained leverage during labor shortages, particularly after the Black Death, leading to evolving social contracts and legislation aimed at maintaining order. The era was characterized by a dynamic interplay between entrenched hierarchies and gradual societal change. Education and literacy were also expanding. Monastic schools, cathedral schools, and early universities, such as Oxford, provided training in theology, law, and the liberal arts. Chroniclers, poets, and historians documented events with increasing sophistication, preserving the story of England for posterity. Figures such as Geoffrey of Monmouth contributed to the mythic and historical narratives, blending legend with history, while legal and administrative records ensured that the practical governance of England was meticulously documented. In essence, the Plantagenet period represents a crucible of political, social, and cultural transformation. From Henry II's legal and administrative reforms to the Wars of the Roses' dynastic violence, England evolved from a patchwork of feudal territories into a kingdom with centralized authority, codified law, and enduring cultural achievements. The interplay of warfare, diplomacy, plague, and innovation created a society that was both resilient and adaptable, capable of withstanding internal and external pressures while laying the groundwork for the nation-state that would emerge in the Tudor era. The legacy of the Plantagenets is manifold: common law, parliamentary precedents, administrative centralization, architectural innovation, and a rich literary culture. These centuries of evolution, conflict, and synthesis prepared England for its future as a unified kingdom, capable of asserting influence both in Europe and, eventually, across the globe. By 1485, England had endured conquest, civil war, plague, and dynastic strife, emerging stronger, more centralized, and culturally vibrant than at any previous moment in its history. The era closed with the Tudor victory at Bosworth Field, ready to embark on a new chapter of religious transformation, maritime expansion, and imperial ambition. The death of Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485 brought the tumultuous Wars of the Roses to a close and inaugurated the reign of Henry VII, the first Tudor monarch. Emerging victorious from decades of dynastic strife, Henry VII faced a kingdom weary of civil war, yet brimming with opportunity. He established the Tudor dynasty, carefully consolidating power through a combination of political shrewdness, strategic marriages, and the strengthening of royal authority, laying the foundations for an era of relative stability that would transform England politically, economically, and culturally. Henry VII understood that legitimacy and stability required careful management of both the nobility and the crown's finances. By imposing bonds and recognizances, he curbed the power of potentially rebellious nobles, while simultaneously fostering loyalty through patronage. Marrying Elizabeth of York, he united the warring houses of Lancaster and York, symbolically and politically reconciling centuries of conflict. Henry's cautious fiscal policies, including the efficient collection of taxes and customs duties, replenished the royal treasury, allowing the crown to assert authority without over-reliance on parliamentary consent. Henry's son, Henry VIII, 1509 to 1547, would become one of England's most consequential monarchs, transforming the kingdom in ways that would reverberate for centuries. The early part of Henry VIII's reign focused on consolidation, war, and prestige. England engaged in continental alliances and military campaigns, striving to assert influence in France and beyond. Henry cultivated a court celebrated for its grandeur, chivalric ideals, and display of royal magnificence, elevating England's international profile. Yet it was his dramatic religious transformation that would redefine the very fabric of English society. The English Reformation, initiated in the 1530s, was catalyzed by Henry VIII's desire for an annulment from Catherine of Aragon, a request refused by the Pope. In response, Henry severed England's ties with the Roman Catholic Church, declaring himself the supreme head of the Church of England through the Act of Supremacy, 1534. This bold move dissolved monasteries, redistributed vast church lands, and redirected religious and economic authority to the crown. The Reformation was not merely a theological shift, it redefined governance, property, and society. Monastic networks, long centers of learning and welfare, were dismantled, while former church lands bolstered the crown and allied nobility, reshaping social hierarchies. Religious reform under Henry VIII also catalyzed profound cultural and intellectual change. English-language Bibles became widely available, introducing literacy and scriptural engagement to broader segments of society. The dissolution of monasteries forced the aristocracy and urban elites to assume new roles in governance and charity, while England's legal system expanded to enforce the new religious order. Though Henry's break with Rome was initially pragmatic, it unleashed centuries of religious debate, persecution, and reform, setting the stage for profound theological and political struggles in subsequent reigns. The Tudor legacy was further cemented under Elizabeth I, 1558 to 1603, whose reign is often remembered as England's Golden Age. Elizabeth inherited a nation divided by religious strife and threatened by continental powers, yet she stabilized the realm through a combination of political acumen, strategic compromise, and deft diplomacy. The Elizabethan religious settlement balanced Protestant reform with traditional elements, establishing the Church of England as a national institution while seeking to avoid extremes that might provoke civil unrest. Elizabeth's foreign policy emphasized pragmatism and maritime strength. England confronted Spanish dominance, particularly under Philip II, culminating in the dramatic defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588. England's naval victories not only safeguarded the realm, but also signaled its emergence as a formidable maritime power, capable of projecting influence beyond its shores. The victory was celebrated domestically as divine favor and the triumph of national resilience, reinforcing Elizabeth's authority and fostering a sense of collective identity and pride. Culturally, the Elizabethan era witnessed an extraordinary flourishing of literature, theater, and the arts. Figures such as William Shakespeare, Christopher Marlowe, and Edmund Spenser transformed English letters, producing works of enduring beauty, political commentary, and philosophical depth. The court and nobility became patrons of music, painting, and architecture, integrating Renaissance ideals into English society. Education expanded, with grammar schools and universities providing intellectual grounding for an increasingly literate and engaged populace. Economically, Tudor England experienced significant growth and transformation. The population steadily increased, stimulating urban expansion and the development of towns as centers of trade, craft, and culture. The wool trade, particularly from the Cotswolds and East Anglia, flourished, while England's engagement with European commerce, including the Low Countries and Mediterranean markets, expanded both wealth and political influence. Maritime exploration, fueled by figures such as Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh, laid the groundwork for future global engagement and overseas colonization, extending England's reach far beyond the European continent. Socially, the Tudor period redefined hierarchies and mobility. Nobility and gentry were increasingly involved in local and national administration, participating in courts, commissions, and government. The Tudor dynasty, spanning Henry VII to Elizabeth I, fundamentally reshaped England. Politically, it strengthened the monarchy, centralized authority, and established institutions capable of enduring beyond individual reigns. Religiously, it reoriented the kingdom from papal authority to national ecclesiastical control, embedding Protestant reform while navigating deep divisions. Culturally, it fostered a renaissance of arts, letters, and exploration, positioning England as an emerging European power. Economically, trade, agriculture, and maritime ventures laid the groundwork for global engagement and imperial ambition. By the end of Elizabeth I's reign in 1603, England had emerged from centuries of dynastic struggle and civil strife into a unified, increasingly literate, culturally vibrant, and globally ambitious nation. The Tudor period had transformed governance, law, religion, and society, forging the foundations upon which the Stuart dynasty would build. The legacies of naval dominance, administrative centralization, religious reform, and cultural flourishing defined England's trajectory for the coming centuries, signaling the emergence of a nation prepared to assert influence, both within Europe and across the wider world. The Tudors' achievements were not merely institutional or military. They shaped the identity and consciousness of the English people. Literacy, engagement with the arts, religious participation, and participation in civic life fostered a collective sense of belonging and nationhood. England had transitioned from a land of fragmented kingdoms into a cohesive society capable of coordinated governance, cultural production, and international diplomacy. The foundations laid by the Tudors would endure, informing the subsequent challenges and triumphs of Stuart rule, civil war, and global expansion. The death of Elizabeth I in 1603 marked the end of the Tudor dynasty and the beginning of a new era under the Stuarts. James VI of Scotland, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, ascended the English throne as James I, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland. This personal union was unprecedented and symbolically significant. For the first time, the two kingdoms shared a monarch, although they remained politically and legally distinct. James I's reign, spanning 1603 to 1625, introduced a period of cultural and intellectual flourishing, yet it also set the stage for centuries-long tensions between monarchy and parliament that would culminate in civil war. James I brought with him a vision of divine monarchy, asserting that kings ruled by God's mandate and were accountable to no earthly authority. This belief, rooted in the concept of the divine right of kings, often clashed with an increasingly assertive parliament, which sought to safeguard the rights of subjects and exert control over taxation and legislation. The conflict between absolutist monarchy and parliamentary governance emerged as a central theme of Stuart England, shaping politics, society, and constitutional development for generations. Religiously, James I inherited a divided realm. The Church of England, established under the Tudors, faced internal dissent from Puritans who sought further reform, as well as from Catholic factions who resisted Protestant orthodoxy. The king's efforts to balance religious factions culminated in the commissioning of the King James Bible, 1611, a translation that sought to unify worship while enhancing royal authority. The translation became a monumental cultural achievement, shaping the English language, literature, and religious practice for centuries. while reinforcing the crown's central role in religious life. James I's reign also witnessed early colonization and maritime expansion. England, eager to compete with Spain and Portugal, sponsored ventures to the Americas, including the ill-fated Roanoke colony and the later establishment of Jamestown in 1607 under James's charter. These efforts reflected both economic ambition and strategic positioning, signaling England's transition from a regional power to an emerging global actor. Yet these projects were fraught with challenges, including financial strain, logistical difficulties, and violent encounters with indigenous populations. Upon James's death, his son Charles I, 1625 to 1649, inherited the crown. Charles continued his father's belief in the divine right of kings, but his insistence on unchallenged authority, heavy taxation without parliamentary consent, and religious reforms alienated many of his subjects. Conflict intensified over matters such as ship money, a tax levied without parliamentary approval, and the enforcement of Anglican practices in Scotland, culminating in the Bishops' Wars, 1639 to 1640. Charles's policies highlighted the inherent tension between centralized monarchy and emerging parliamentary power, tensions that would erupt into full-scale conflict. By 1642, England was engulfed in civil war. The English Civil War, 1642 to 1651, pitted the Royalists, Cavaliers, loyal to Charles I, against the Parliamentarians, Roundheads, led by figures such as Oliver Cromwell. Battles like Edgehill, 1642, Marston Moor, 1644, and Naseby, 1645, exemplified the brutality and strategic innovation of the period. Cromwell's new model army, disciplined and ideologically motivated, emerged as a decisive force, reshaping military organization and demonstrating the effectiveness of merit-based command structures over traditional aristocratic leadership. The Civil War culminated in the unprecedented trial and execution of Charles I in 1649, signaling the temporary abolition of the monarchy and the establishment of the Commonwealth of England. Cromwell assumed the role of Lord Protector, effectively a Republican head of state, although in practice, wielding near-monarchical authority. This period, though brief, marked one of the most radical experiments in governance in European history, a kingdom without a king, ruled by a parliamentary military hybrid regime. Cromwell's rule focused on both domestic stability and international influence. Internally, he enforced moral reforms rooted in Puritanism, regulating behavior, worship, and public life. Militarily, England expanded its naval power, projecting influence to the Americas, the Caribbean, and the European continent. Cromwell's campaigns in Ireland and Scotland, however, were marked by brutality and lasting resentment, reflecting the darker side of governance in times of ideological extremism. Following Cromwell's death in 1658, political instability returned. The Commonwealth faltered, and in 1660, the monarchy was restored under Charles II, son of Charles I. This period, known as the Restoration, revived traditional institutions, re-established the Church of England, and encouraged cultural renewal. Theaters reopened, literature and scientific inquiry flourished, and urban life in London expanded. Yet the memory of civil war lingered, and the monarchy's authority remained contingent upon cooperation with Parliament, highlighting the enduring legacy of the Stuart constitutional struggle. Charles II's reign also contended with religious tensions and political intrigue. The king's perceived Catholic sympathies coupled with fears of absolutism fueled suspicion and periodic crises exemplified by the Popish Plot, 1678, and the Exclusion Crisis, which attempted to bar his brother James II from succession due to his Catholic faith. The balance between royal prerogative and parliamentary oversight continued to evolve, underscoring the increasingly participatory nature of governance in England. James II ascended in 1685, and his overt Catholicism and attempts to assert monarchical authority alarmed both Parliament and the populace. The resulting Glorious Revolution, 1688, in which William of Orange and his wife Mary, James's Protestant daughter, were invited to assume the throne, effectively ended the possibility of absolute monarchy in England. The revolution was largely bloodless, hence its name, but it profoundly altered the English political landscape. The subsequent Bill of Rights, 1689, codified parliamentary supremacy, established limits on royal authority, and guaranteed certain civil liberties, creating a constitutional framework that would endure into the modern era. The Stuart period, spanning from James I to Queen and in 1714, was thus a crucible of political experimentation, conflict, and transformation. England transitioned from a monarchy claiming divine and absolute authority to a constitutional system balancing the crown, parliament, and law. The era witnessed revolution, civil war, religious upheaval, and intellectual flourishing, laying the foundations for parliamentary democracy, legal reform, and national identity. Economically, the 17th century saw significant developments. Agriculture modernized, trade expanded, and early colonial ventures laid the groundwork for England's global mercantile empire. Urban centers grew, financial institutions such as banks and stock exchanges emerged, and England's economy became increasingly integrated with European and Atlantic networks. These economic transformations were intertwined with political stability, religious conformity, and social negotiation, illustrating the complex interplay between governance, commerce, and society. Culturally, by the end of the Stuart era in 1714, England had endured civil war, regicide, republican experiment, restoration, revolution, and the formal establishment of a constitutional monarchy. The period's legacies in law, governance, military organization, economic expansion, and cultural achievement would shape the trajectory of the nation well into the Industrial Revolution and beyond, demonstrating that the turbulent century of the Stuarts was both destructive and generative, a crucible in which modern England began to take definitive form. The accession of George I in 1714 inaugurated the Georgian era, beginning the rule of the Hanoverian dynasty in England. George I, a German prince who spoke little English, relied heavily on ministers and parliament to govern, inadvertently strengthening parliamentary authority and laying the groundwork for modern constitutional governance. Over the ensuing century, England experienced profound political, social, and economic transformation as the monarchy, though distant, presided over a rapidly changing society increasingly integrated into global trade networks. The early Georgian period was marked by political consolidation and the development of modern parliamentary government. Prime ministers, such as Sir Robert Walpole, emerged as effective leaders, managing the intricate balance between the crown, parliament, and the electorate. Political parties, Whigs and Tories, solidified their roles, reflecting ideological, economic, and regional divisions within the kingdom. This system, though often exclusive and aristocratic, represented a significant shift from monarchical absolutism, placing elected representatives at the heart of governance and decision-making. Economically, the 18th century laid the foundations for England's Industrial Revolution, a transformation that would redefine the nation and the world. Early innovations in agriculture, known as the Agricultural Revolution, increased productivity through crop rotation, selective breeding, and improved tools. These changes freed labor from rural subsistence, creating a workforce available for industrial production. Enclosures of common lands, while economically efficient, displaced many peasants, fueling migration to emerging towns and cities and setting the stage for urbanization. Industry expanded rapidly, driven by technological innovation. The steam engine, perfected by James Watt, revolutionized mining, textiles, and transportation. Mechanized spinning and weaving transformed the production of cloth, enabling unprecedented output and fostering the growth of factory towns. Coal and iron became central resources, powering machines and fueling infrastructure projects such as canals and railways. England became the workshop of the world, exporting manufactured goods globally and establishing itself as a hub of industrial and commercial power. Urbanization, while economically productive, introduced new social challenges. Cities like Manchester, Birmingham, and Liverpool expanded at remarkable speed, often without adequate sanitation, housing, or social services. Industrial labor conditions were harsh. Long hours, low wages, and unsafe working environments were common. Yet these difficulties sparked social consciousness, reform movements, and early labor organizations, laying the groundwork for England's evolving approach to social policy in the 19th century. Culturally, the Georgian era reflected both continuity and innovation. The Enlightenment inspired intellectual inquiry, scientific advancement, and philosophical debate. Figures such as Adam Smith, whose Wealth of Nations, 1776, articulated the principles of free market economics, shaped not only English thought, but global economic theory. Science, literature, and the arts flourished, with writers, painters, and architects producing works that reflected both classical ideals and contemporary experience. Cities were adorned with neoclassical architecture, reflecting order, progress, and civic pride. Internationally, England navigated a complex web of conflicts and diplomacy. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, expanded England's imperial reach, particularly in North America and India, but also sowed seeds of unrest that would culminate in the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783. Loss of the American colonies represented a major setback, but also prompted reassessment of imperial policy, military strategy, and colonial governance. England simultaneously expanded its influence in India, laying the groundwork for the British Empire's consolidation in Asia, and maintained its position in Europe through strategic alliances and military engagements against France and other continental powers. The French Revolutionary, 1789 to 1799, and Napoleonic Wars, 1803 to 1815, further tested England's political, economic, and military resilience. The threat of invasion, combined with economic disruption, prompted domestic reforms and strengthened national identity. England's navy, exemplified by victories at Trafalgar, 1805, under Admiral Horatio Nelson, secured maritime dominance and protected trade routes, enabling the continued expansion of global commerce. The wars catalyzed innovation in logistics, finance, and administration, reinforcing England's capacity to mobilize resources on a national and imperial scale. Domestically, the Georgian era witnessed social and legal reform. The Industrial Revolution created pressures for the regulation of labor, urban planning, and public health. While many reforms were incremental, the period saw growing awareness of social inequality and the responsibilities of government and civil institutions. Education began to expand beyond elite circles, fostering literacy and intellectual engagement among broader segments of the population. Enlightenment ideals encouraged civic participation, critical thinking, and debate on issues ranging from governance to human rights. Religion continued to shape society, though in evolving ways. The Church of England maintained its central role, yet dissenting denominations and Methodism gained influence, reflecting both spiritual revival and social engagement. Religious institutions contributed to charitable work, education, and community cohesion, while debates over religious tolerance and the relationship between church and state reflected broader Enlightenment concerns about freedom and governance. The Georgian period also witnessed remarkable cultural achievement. Literature flourished with figures such as Samuel Johnson, Jane Austen, and William Blake, whose works explored human experience, morality, and society. Music, architecture, and visual arts reflected both classical influence and emerging national identity. The period's cultural output was intimately linked with social and technological change, reflecting an England in transition, negotiating tradition and modernity, stability, and innovation. By the early 19th century, the Industrial Revolution had transformed England's economy, society, and global role. Mechanization, transportation networks, and urban expansion redefined daily life, labor, and commerce. Canals, roads, and eventually railways facilitated the movement of goods and people, linking regions and markets in ways previously unimaginable. Trade, both domestic and international, expanded rapidly, positioning England at the center of a growing global economy. The social consequences of industrialization were profound. Urban overcrowding, child labor, and public health crises prompted reformers to advocate for social legislation. Early factory acts, public health initiatives, and educational reforms began to address the challenges of a rapidly changing society. Labor unrest, including strikes and protests, signaled the emergence of collective consciousness and the beginnings of organized labor movements, which would shape political and social life in subsequent decades. Politically, the period saw the expansion of parliamentary influence and gradual reform. The Reform Act of 1832, although technically beyond the early Georgian era, had roots in the political pressures and social changes of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The act addressed representation inequities in Parliament, reflecting the growing recognition of urban populations and industrial centers as essential components of governance. England's evolving political system demonstrated the interplay between societal change, economic development, and institutional adaptation. The culmination of the Georgian era, by the reign of William IV and the early reign of Queen Victoria, represents a society transformed by industrialization, urbanization, intellectual ferment, and global engagement. England emerged as a preeminent economic and naval power, with social structures, political institutions, and cultural life reflecting centuries of adaptation, innovation, and struggle. The Hanoverian monarchs, though sometimes distant, presided over a nation increasingly capable of self-governance, scientific advancement, and global influence. The Georgian era and the Industrial Revolution transformed England from a primarily agrarian and regional power into a globally connected industrial state. Advances in agriculture, industry, technology, and commerce reshaped the economy, while urbanization, social reform, and cultural flourishing redefined society. Politically, England moved toward constitutional governance, balancing royal prerogative with parliamentary authority. Internationally, conflicts and trade expanded England's influence, setting the stage for the Victoria inherited a nation fundamentally transformed by the Industrial Revolution. Factories, railways, and mechanized production had reshaped the economy and social structures. Urban centers, such as London, Manchester, and Birmingham, were growing at unprecedented rates, fueled by migration from rural areas and the influx of labor for industrial production. While cities became hubs of opportunity, they were also centers of overcrowding, disease, and poverty, highlighting the stark contrast between technological progress and social welfare. Economically, England was the workshop of the world. Industrial output expanded exponentially, and the nation dominated global trade networks, exporting manufactured goods, coal, and machinery across Europe, the Americas, and Asia. Innovations in transport, particularly railways and steamships, connected regions, facilitated commerce, and accelerated urbanization. The Industrial Revolution had created new social classes, including an influential industrial bourgeoisie and a growing urban working class, whose needs and aspirations would increasingly shape politics, labor relations, and social policy. The The Victorian era was also defined by imperial expansion. England's empire reached its zenith, encompassing vast territories in Africa, Asia, the Americas, and the Pacific. The administration of colonies required sophisticated bureaucracy, military presence, and economic management. Conflicts, such as the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, and campaigns in India following the Indian Rebellion of 1857, underscored the complexities of maintaining an empire, combining military strategy, diplomacy, and governance. The empire brought wealth and resources, but also moral, ethical, and political debates about authority, exploitation, and self-determination. Domestically, Victorian England underwent profound social reform. Public health crises in rapidly growing urban centers prompted legislation addressing sanitation, housing, and disease prevention. The Public Health Act of 1848 and subsequent reforms sought to mitigate cholera outbreaks and improve urban living conditions. Education expanded through the Education Act of 1870, establishing elementary schooling for children and fostering literacy among broader segments of society. Labor reforms addressed child labor, working hours, and industrial safety, reflecting a growing recognition of governmental responsibility to regulate economic activity and protect citizens. The political landscape evolved alongside economic and social change. The Victorian era witnessed the gradual extension of suffrage, beginning with the Reform Acts of 1832, 1867, and 1884, which enfranchised broader segments of the population, including the urban middle and working classes. Parliamentary democracy became increasingly central to governance, while monarchic power became more symbolic, reflecting the enduring constitutional arrangements established during the Stuart and Georgian periods. Political parties, public opinion, and civic activism gained influence, shaping legislation and national priorities. Culturally, Victorian England was a period of extraordinary intellectual and artistic achievement. Literature flourished with figures such as Charles Dickens, the Bronte sisters, Thomas Hardy, and Alfred Tennyson, whose works explored social conditions, morality, and human experience. Scientific inquiry advanced through figures like Charles Darwin, whose On the Origin of Species, 1859, revolutionized the understanding of biology and humanity's place in nature. Art, architecture, and music reflected both traditional and innovative trends, blending classical influences with modern sensibilities and signaling the nation's engagement with global and domestic cultural currents. Religion remained a potent social force, influencing morality, education, and civic life. The Church of England maintained its established position, yet religious pluralism and dissenting movements, including Methodism and Unitarianism, expanded influence, particularly in urban and industrial regions. Missionary activity abroad reflected both spiritual zeal and imperial ambition, intertwining religious outreach with England's growing global presence. Tensions over secularization, scientific discovery, and theological debate characterized public discourse, revealing the complexities of moral and social authority in a modernizing society. Victorian England also faced challenges and crises that tested its resilience. Economic cycles, including depressions, unemployment, and agricultural hardship, underscored the vulnerabilities inherent in industrial and global integration. Social unrest, including movements advocating workers' rights and political representation, reflected the aspirations of a population increasingly conscious of its collective power. The government responded with incremental reform, negotiation, and occasionally repression, demonstrating the delicate balance between stability, progress, and popular demand. Technological and infrastructural advancements defined daily life and economic capacity. Railways, canals, and roads revolutionized transport, facilitating the movement of goods, labor, and information. Telegraph networks enabled near-instant communication across cities and continents, enhancing commercial coordination, governance, and military operations. Urban planning, sanitation systems, and public services gradually improved the quality of life, reflecting the interplay between technological innovation and societal need. The Victorian era's global influence was mirrored in cultural diplomacy and soft power. English literature, science, and industry were admired and emulated worldwide. English became a global language of commerce, law, and scholarship, facilitating communication and trade across the expanding empire. London emerged as the epicenter of finance, trade, and culture, drawing intellectuals, entrepreneurs, and migrants, and becoming a symbol of England's modernity, innovation, and global reach. The monarchy, personified by Queen Victoria, became a symbol of national identity and stability. Victoria's long reign and public image embodied continuity, moral rectitude, and civic duty, even as society underwent rapid transformation. The royal family's engagement with public life, ceremonial duties, and representation of national values reinforced social cohesion and provided a sense of continuity amidst economic, political, and cultural upheaval. By the close of the 19th century, Victorian England had transformed profoundly. The industrial and urban revolutions had redefined economic activity, social structures, and spatial organization. Political reform had expanded representation, reinforced constitutional governance, and established mechanisms for addressing social grievances. Cultural, scientific, and intellectual achievements had positioned England as a leader in global thought, while the empire's expansion reflected both economic ambition and complex ethical and political dilemmas. Yet, beneath prosperity and progress, the era faced unresolved tensions. Class disparities, labor unrest, and colonial conflicts highlighted structural inequalities. Religious debates, scientific discoveries, and social reform movements reflected ongoing negotiations over morality, authority, and human rights. Urbanization and industrialization created challenges of public health, social cohesion, and governance that would continue to demand attention in the 20th century. Victorian England represents the culmination of centuries of political, economic, and cultural evolution. From industrial dominance to imperial expansion, from social reform to intellectual achievement, the period encapsulated both the triumphs and contradictions of a society in rapid transformation. England emerged as a modern nation-state, capable of exerting influence across continents while grappling with the complex demands of industrial society, democratic governance, and global responsibility. The legacies of Victorian England, industrial innovation, parliamentary democracy, global commerce, cultural achievement, and imperial reach would shape the trajectory of the 20th century, influencing social, economic, and political developments at home and abroad. By 1901, with the death of Queen Victoria, England had become a nation both proud of its accomplishments and acutely aware of the challenges that modernization, social change, and global competition would bring. The dawn of the 20th century heralded profound transformation and unprecedented challenge for England. Following the death of Queen Victoria in 1901, her son Edward VII ascended the throne, ushering in the Edwardian era, a period of relative stability, cultural refinement, and technological progress. Yet beneath the veneer of prosperity, the nation faced tensions that would escalate into global conflict, social upheaval, and a redefinition of England's place in the world. The Edwardian period, 1901 to 1910, reflected the continuing influence of Victorian institutions while introducing subtle modernization. Technological innovations, such as electricity, automobiles, and telecommunication, transformed urban and domestic life. Cultural life thrived, with the arts, literature, and theater reflecting both refinement and social critique. Political debates increasingly focused on social reform, the extension of suffrage, labor rights, and Ireland's quest for autonomy, revealing the pressures of a rapidly modernizing society. The early 20th century was dominated, however, by the growing specter of global conflict. England, as a leading European power and colonial empire, was deeply entwined in alliances, rivalries, and imperial competition. The complex web of diplomacy, national ambition, and military buildup culminated in World War I, 1914 to 1918, a conflict that reshaped England politically, socially, and economically. The war demanded total mobilization. Millions of men enlisted, industries shifted to war production, and society was organized. Politically, England navigated a shifting landscape. The rise of the Labour Party reflected the growing influence of industrial workers and urban populations, challenging the traditional dominance of the Conservative and Liberal parties. Reforms such as the Representation of the People Act, 1918, expanded suffrage, enfranchising nearly all men and women over 30, marking a decisive step toward representative democracy. Constitutional monarchy endured, but political power increasingly rested in Parliament, reflecting long-term trends in governance established during the Stuart, Georgian, and Victorian periods. Internationally, England sought to maintain influence in a rapidly changing world. The Treaty of Versailles, 1919, confirmed England's status as a leading power, yet the post-war order was fragile. Colonial administration faced challenges in India, Africa, and the Middle East, where nationalist movements demanded reform, autonomy, or independence. England's imperial reach remained extensive, but global tensions, economic competition, and social change indicated that the empire's dominance was increasingly contested. The interwar years were also a period of cultural and intellectual dynamism. Modernism in literature, art, and philosophy reflected responses to war, industrialization, and social change. Figures such as Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, and D.H. Lawrence challenged conventional norms, exploring human consciousness, morality, and societal transformation. Science advanced rapidly, with breakthroughs in medicine, physics, and engineering reshaping understanding and capability. Social debates over labor rights, women's roles, and education intensified, reflecting an England negotiating modernity while confronting enduring inequalities. The approach of World War II, 1939 to 1945, was preceded by geopolitical tension, economic uncertainty, and ideological conflict across Europe. England, under leaders such as Neville Chamberlain and later Winston Churchill, sought to balance diplomacy, military preparedness, and public reassurance in the face of rising fascism. The war demanded unprecedented mobilization, uniting society around the existential threat posed by Nazi Germany and its allies. England's experience during World War II would test resilience, strategy, and national identity in ways unparalleled since the Civil War and Napoleonic Wars. The Blitz, 1940 to 1941, Germany's sustained aerial bombardment of English cities brought destruction and terror to civilians, yet also demonstrated remarkable social cohesion and resilience. London, Coventry, and other urban centers suffered extensive damage, yet the population adapted through evacuation, civil defense, and collective solidarity. Air raids, rationing, and the constant threat of violence reshaped daily life, reinforcing the importance of national unity, leadership, and civic responsibility. Military campaigns during World War II also highlighted England's strategic capabilities. The Royal Navy controlled sea lanes, safeguarding supply lines and imperial communications. The Royal Air Force, particularly during the Battle of Britain, demonstrated technological innovation, organizational skill, and decisive strategy. England's contributions to Allied efforts, both in Europe and globally, underscored its continued relevance as a military and diplomatic actor, even as the empire faced long-term pressures and emerging independence movements. Economically, the war accelerated state intervention and coordination. Wartime production, rationing, and labor mobilization required unprecedented government oversight, foreshadowing post-war planning and welfare initiatives. Women again played crucial roles in industry, agriculture, and civil administration, cementing social transformations initiated during World War I. Education, healthcare, and public services adapted to wartime needs, demonstrating the state's capacity to coordinate resources and respond to crisis. The early 20th century also witnessed a technological revolution. Innovations in aviation, radio, medicine, and manufacturing reshaped society, commerce, and warfare. The internal combustion engine, mechanized agriculture, and communication technologies transformed industry and everyday life, while scientific discoveries, ranging from relativity to antibiotics, expanded knowledge and capability. England, at the forefront of industrial and scientific development, leveraged these advancements for both civilian and military purposes, consolidating its status as a technologically advanced nation. By the end of World War II in 1945, England had endured 2 world wars, each devastating in human and material terms. The nation emerged politically, socially, and economically transformed. Democracy had expanded, women had achieved greater rights and recognition, and industrial and technological capacity had reached unprecedented levels. Yet the cost of conflict, combined with emerging global competition and the inevitability of decolonization, signaled that the mid-20th century would demand adaptation, reconstruction, and redefinition of England's global role. The early 20th century demonstrates that England's history is defined by resilience, adaptation, and transformation. From the Edwardian pursuit of cultural refinement to the total wars of the 20th century, the nation navigated unprecedented challenges, balancing domestic stability, imperial ambitions, technological innovation, and social reform. The experiences of this period laid the groundwork for post-war reconstruction, welfare initiatives, and the eventual transition from imperial power to a modern, globally connected state. The period from 1901 to 1945 was one of dramatic upheaval and profound transformation. England's political institutions evolved to meet the demands of democracy and social change. Its economy shifted from industrial maturation to total war mobilization, and its culture reflected the tensions and aspirations of a society grappling with modernity. England entered the post-war era with a legacy of endurance, innovation, and global engagement, prepared to confront the challenges of reconstruction, decolonization, and technological advancement in the latter half of the 20th century. The end of World War II in 1945 marked a profound turning point for England. The nation emerged victorious yet exhausted, facing a landscape of social, economic, and geopolitical challenges. Cities bore the scars of aerial bombardment. Industries had been repurposed for wartime production, and the population had endured years of rationing and upheaval. Yet amidst this devastation arose a vision for rebuilding a society that would address inequality, modernize infrastructure, and redefine England's place in a rapidly changing world. Politically, post-war England was shaped by a remarkable mandate for reform. The Labour Party, under Clement Attlee, won a landslide victory in 1945, signaling popular demand for transformative policies. Attlee's government embarked on an ambitious program to reconstruct the nation, introducing social welfare initiatives designed to mitigate the hardships exposed by the war. The National Health Service, NHS, established in 1948, provided universal health care free at the point of use, representing a radical departure from previous models and a cornerstone of the post-war welfare state. Alongside the NHS, programs addressing housing, education, and social security were implemented, reflecting a comprehensive vision for an equitable society. Economic reconstruction was a formidable challenge. England faced debt from wartime expenditures, the need to rebuild infrastructure, and the loss of overseas markets due to decolonization and changing global dynamics. The Marshall Plan, initiated by the United States, provided crucial support for rebuilding industry and stabilizing the economy. Industries transitioned from wartime production to peacetime needs, while technological advancement accelerated, particularly in manufacturing, energy, and transport sectors. Urban redevelopment reshaped cities devastated by bombings, introducing modern architecture, improved sanitation, and public housing to accommodate a growing population. The geopolitical landscape transformed dramatically during this period. The British Empire underwent rapid decolonization as former colonies in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean sought independence. India and Pakistan achieved sovereignty in 1947, marking a pivotal moment in global history. Across Africa, the Caribbean, and Southeast Asia, nationalist movements gained momentum, reflecting the shifting balance of power and signaling the end of formal imperial control. England retained influence through the Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary association emphasizing cooperation, trade, and cultural connection. Yet the era of empire as a source of wealth and political dominance was effectively over. Socially, post-war England experienced transformation and modernization. The population became increasingly urbanized, with migration from rural areas and former colonies contributing to growing cultural diversity. Windrush generation migrants from the Caribbean arrived in the late 1940s and 1950s, shaping urban culture, labor markets, and the social fabric of cities like London, Birmingham, and Manchester. This influx introduced new cultural influences, music, cuisine, and social dynamics, while also creating challenges around integration, identity, and race relations that would persist into the late 20th century. Culturally, England entered a period of innovation, experimentation, and global influence. Literature, music, and the arts reflected the realities of post-war society while engaging with international trends. Writers such as George Orwell, Graham Greene, and Kingsley Amis explored themes of politics, morality, and identity. In music, the emergence of British jazz, pop, and later rock culture, exemplified by figures like the Beatles, would revolutionize global popular culture. Politically, the period was defined by alternating governments and ideological debate. Labor governments implemented welfare and nationalization programs, while conservative governments, particularly under Harold Macmillan and later Margaret Thatcher, emphasized market liberalization, privatization, and individual enterprise. The tension between collectivist and market-oriented policies reflected broader debates over governance, the role of the state, and the economic direction of a post-imperial England. These debates had lasting consequences for economic structure, social policy, and political alignment into the 21st century. England also faced significant technological and industrial transformation. Advances in energy, transportation, and communications reshaped society and the economy. The expansion of the motor industry, aerospace engineering, and telecommunications strengthened industrial capacity while fostering innovation. Technological change was accompanied by shifts in labor markets, urban planning, and social organization, reflecting the interconnected nature of industrial, economic, and societal development. England became increasingly connected internally and globally, integrating emerging technologies into everyday life and governance. During this period, England also navigated complex international relations. The Cold War created strategic pressures, compelling alignment with the United States and participation in NATO while managing relations with the Soviet bloc. Defense, intelligence, and foreign policy priorities shaped government decision-making and public perception, while England's influence on international institutions and global governance remained significant even as its formal empire receded. Social movements gained prominence in the latter half of the 20th century. Civil rights campaigns, women's rights initiatives, and labor organizations reflected growing awareness of equality, representation, and social justice. Legislative reforms addressed discrimination, labor conditions, and civic participation, reshaping English society and embedding principles of fairness, inclusion, and accountability. Public discourse increasingly embraced democratic ideals, human rights, and cultural pluralism, signaling the emergence of a modern, participatory civic culture. Cultural life thrived alongside social and technological change. The swinging 60s, British cinema, theater, and television reflected both domestic identity and global engagement. English writers, filmmakers, and musicians gained international recognition, reinforcing England's position as a cultural innovator. Urbanization, media expansion, and technological connectivity facilitated the spread of ideas, shaping public consciousness and contributing to a shared sense of national identity in a rapidly globalizing world. The latter decades of the 20th century saw England confronting economic challenges, political realignment, and societal change. Industrial decline in traditional sectors, debates over European integration, and the rise of neoliberal economic policies under Margaret Thatcher, 1979 to 1990, reshaped the economy and governance. Privatization, deregulation, and emphasis on market-driven growth generated prosperity for some while creating dislocation for others, highlighting the persistent tension between economic modernization and social stability. By the 1990s, England had transitioned into a modern, post-industrial society. Devolution debates in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland reflected ongoing negotiation of national identity and governance within the United Kingdom. Technological advancement, globalization, and cultural diversity defined public life, the economy, and policy. England's role on the international stage shifted from empire building to diplomacy, trade, and participation in multinational organizations, reflecting both historical continuity and adaptation to a rapidly changing world. The period from 1945 to 1997 represents a century of transformation, rebuilding, and reinvention. Post-war England confronted the challenges of Reconstruction, decolonization, social reform, and modernization while consolidating democratic institutions and technological capacity. Economic change, cultural flourishing, and social evolution redefined the nation's identity and position globally. England emerged from these decades as a resilient, adaptive, and globally connected nation, prepared to enter the 21st century with a complex heritage of achievement, challenge, and innovation. The turn of the 21st century brought England into a period of unprecedented change and complexity. With the election of Tony Blair's Labour government in 1997, England entered a new era of political, social, and economic transformation. Blair's Third Way approach sought to reconcile free market principles with social welfare policies, reflecting a pragmatic response to the challenges of globalization, technological advancement, and evolving societal expectations. This period would be defined by rapid modernization, cultural diversity, and the tension between national sovereignty and international integration. Politically, post-1997 England witnessed substantial devolution and regional governance reforms. Scotland and Wales were granted legislative assemblies with significant powers over education, health, and local governance, reshaping the constitutional structure of the United Kingdom. Northern Ireland's political landscape evolved under the Good Friday Agreement, 1998, ending decades of violent conflict known as the Troubles and establishing frameworks for power sharing and reconciliation. Devolution reflected both the pressures of nationalist movements and a recognition of regional identities, illustrating England's evolving approach to governance and nationhood in a multicultural and multinational context. Economically, England navigated the opportunities and challenges of globalization and technological innovation. The late 1990s and early 2000s saw the expansion of finance, technology, and service sectors, particularly in London, which emerged as a global financial hub. The rise of the internet, mobile communications, and digital commerce transformed business, government, and daily life, accelerating connectivity and economic integration. England leveraged its industrial legacy, educated workforce, and strategic infrastructure to maintain competitiveness, while simultaneously confronting the displacement of traditional industries and the social consequences of economic restructuring. Cultural diversity became a defining feature of contemporary England. Migration from Europe, the Commonwealth, and beyond created a pluralistic society, enriching urban centers with languages, religions, cuisines, and traditions from across the globe. Cities like London, Birmingham, and Manchester evolved as cosmopolitan hubs, balancing local traditions with international influences. Cultural policy, education, and media increasingly reflected this diversity, while debates over identity, integration, and multiculturalism highlighted the complexities of governing a society shaped by global migration and historical legacies. Socially, England confronted new challenges and opportunities in the realms of health, education, and inequality. The National Health Service, NHS, continued to expand and modernize, providing universal health care while adapting to technological, demographic, and fiscal pressures. Education reforms sought to improve access, equity, and standards, emphasizing skills for participation in a global knowledge economy. At the same time, social inequalities persisted, particularly in income, housing, and opportunity, necessitating policy innovation and civic engagement to address persistent disparities. Internationally, England played a central role in global affairs, balancing its historical imperial legacy with contemporary diplomacy, trade, and security responsibilities. Participation in the European Union, NATO, and United Nations frameworks allowed England to influence international policy while managing the complexities of multilateral governance. However, tensions between national sovereignty and supranational institutions became increasingly prominent, culminating in the Brexit referendum of 2016, which initiated England's withdrawal from the EU and prompted profound debate over identity, governance, and international alignment. Security and defense also remained significant concerns. England participated in multinational military engagements, including operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, and counterterrorism initiatives globally. These interventions reflected both historical responsibilities as a global actor and the imperatives of modern geopolitics, illustrating the nation's ongoing negotiation of influence, ethics, and strategic interest in a world increasingly defined by transnational threats and complex alliances. Culturally, the period witnessed unprecedented creative output and global influence. England's contributions to literature, music, film, and visual arts remained significant, while media and technology amplified cultural reach. The British music scene, exemplified by genres such as Britpop, grime, and electronic music, gained international acclaim, while literature and theater continued to grapple with contemporary social themes. Television, film, and digital media expanded storytelling and engagement, reflecting a society simultaneously rooted in history and oriented toward innovation. Technological advancement reshaped all aspects of daily life. The proliferation of the internet, smartphones, and digital platforms has transformed communication, commerce, and social interaction. England became a center for innovation, research, and entrepreneurship, fostering technology clusters and creative industries. Advances in science, medicine, and engineering further strengthened national capacity, while societal adaptation to these rapid changes highlighted the interplay between innovation, regulation, and civic responsibility. Demographically, England experienced aging populations, urban expansion, and increasing cultural heterogeneity. Migration patterns contributed to social dynamism and economic growth, but also generated debates over integration, identity, and public policy. England's response to these demographic shifts reflected the complexity of balancing tradition, civic cohesion, and inclusivity. Environmental and public health concerns emerged as significant issues. England participated in global climate initiatives, energy policy reform, and urban sustainability projects. Public health crises, including pandemics such as COVID-19, tested healthcare systems, governance structures, and civic resilience, demonstrating both the challenges and capacities of a modern state in safeguarding population welfare. These developments highlighted the interconnectedness of domestic policy, global trends, and technological capability. Social movements, political activism, and civic engagement flourished. Campaigns for gender equality, racial justice, environmental sustainability, and workers' rights reflected a society attentive to rights, representation, and accountability. Legislation addressing discrimination, equality, and civic participation reshaped social norms and institutional frameworks, reinforcing the principles of democracy and inclusion that had evolved over centuries. In the cultural sphere, England remained a global trendsetter. Music, literature, theater, film, and television engaged international audiences, while sports, fashion, and media reflected and shaped both national identity and global perception. London's role as a financial, cultural, and technological hub emphasized the interplay between historical legacy, economic capability, and creative innovation. Education, research, and technological enterprise further consolidated England's position as a globally influential society. The contemporary era also witnessed the evolution of national identity and global perception. England navigated its post-imperial legacy while asserting influence in international trade, diplomacy, and culture. Public discourse grappled with questions of historical responsibility, civic cohesion, and the future of governance in a complex, interconnected world. England's historical experience, from Roman conquest to modern democracy, provided context, continuity, and lessons for the challenges of the 21st century. By the early 21st century, England had become a modern, pluralistic, and globally engaged nation, capable of economic innovation, cultural production, and diplomatic influence. Yet the nation also faced enduring challenges, balancing tradition and modernity, managing diversity and integration, and negotiating its role in a complex international system. Technological, social, and political changes required ongoing adaptation, emphasizing resilience, governance, and strategic foresight. The period from 1997 to the present represents England's ongoing negotiation of identity, governance, and global relevance. Devolution, Brexit, globalization, technological transformation, and social diversity define the contemporary experience, while historical continuity informs policy, culture, and civic life. England today is both a product of its nearly 2 millennia history and an actor navigating the uncertainties, opportunities, and complexities of a rapidly changing world. The story of contemporary England demonstrates that the nation's resilience, adaptability, and global engagement remain central to its identity. From Roman legions to digital innovation, from imperial power to multicultural democracy, England continues to evolve, guided by the lessons of history, the pressures of the present, and the possibilities of the future.